as Nigerian evacuees spend their first day back in Nigeria. There's a group of returnees hoping to soon follow them back. But there are also Nigerian refugees who say they're not going back and would rather face the uncertainty of waiting for the war in Ukraine to end. Arise International Correspondent Adefemi Akinsanya has spoken to two such students in Poland who have no intention of returning to Nigeria yet and instead are planning to seek refuge in Europe. We're now joined by Arise News International Correspondent Adefemi Akinsanya, who is at the Polish border in Medyka, where thousands of refugees fleeing from the conflict in Ukraine are crossing into neighboring Poland by road. Good morning, Adefemi. Excellent report. You gave us yesterday on This Day Live. Now you are at Medyka, at the Polish border. What's the situation there?
Well, good morning, Dr. Rubin. What we're seeing now is the humanitarian side of war and conflict. Just behind me, you've got a massive queue of refugees who are hoping to get onto a series of buses and coaches that have been given to them so that they can make their way further into town, cross into areas like Presumptuous, where they can get onto trains and travel into cities like Warsaw. However, another thing that is indicative of what we're seeing here is that there is a vast crowd of predominantly Ukrainian refugees, and you're expecting that because of course the war itself is happening in Ukraine. But as we've just heard from the ambassador that you're speaking to, and as we've known over the last couple of days, more than just Ukrainians have been affected by this conflict. And to reach a border like Medyka, which as you said is a very close border between Poland and the Ukraine, and not see any refugees of color at this point since we've been here this morning is indicative of two things. One, there is definitely proof here that it's been very difficult for Nigerian and African students and people of color to cross into neighboring European countries still at this point. The vast majority of the people here are Ukrainian. The conditions are pretty bleak. Many surrounded by us here are tents that people have been using to sleep. In the meantime, there's also been a very small fire that's been created to generate a little bit of warmth. It's -2 degrees out here, so you can imagine how cold it is, especially during the nighttime. So it is very much a bleak situation. But as I said, the vast majority of the refugees that we've been seeing here are Ukrainian. We've not been able at this point to meet refugees rather of any other background.
It's sobering to note that just 2 weeks ago, all of those people there, all the people that we've seen, including the Nigerian students, were in their warm residences surrounded by all their possessions, and now they're just toughed out into the cold. But I wanted to talk to you, Adefemi, about the position of the Nigerian students who are adamant that they want to stay in Europe and don't want to come home. What is it that informs this? Is coming home to Nigeria and then returning when the war is over not an option? Have they been told that they will not be allowed back? What's that hesitation about?
It's a story of distrust. First and foremost, when they heard about the evacuation flights, they said that they wanted the first batch of people to go just to make sure that it was definitely going to be free and there wouldn't be a situation where the Nigerian government would now ask them to pay for the flight that they have just taken. So there was that. On top of that, there was also the fear that there would be nothing for them to return to and nowhere for them to go. But for the people I have spoken to, they are adamant that they are going to stay in Eastern Europe because they believe that this war in Ukraine will end soon. It makes logical sense. Why not return home? Why not return to Nigeria and obviously make your way back? At this point, we've not heard of anything stopping anybody from returning to Ukraine from Nigeria or any other African country once this war is formally over. But that is a risk a lot of these students are not willing to take. They would much rather brave the cold, harsh conditions, racism, to stay in Eastern Europe and find their way back into Ukraine once this war is over. We heard from William James, who is a 5th-year medical student, who says he's put too much time and effort into his studies in becoming a doctor for him to turn back now. So it just shows you the resilience on one hand, but also the sadness people must feel, the lack of trust that they must have in terms of returning to Nigeria and being safe for the time being. Many of them would much rather stay in Eastern Europe and wait this war out, no matter how long it will take.
All right, Femi, let's talk about the visa situation of Nigerians that want to stay back in places like Hungary, Romania, and the likes. We heard the Hungarian authorities that the Nigerians had to have a little protest before they finally granted them 1 month that they can extend. What's the visa situation like in those countries for Nigerians that want to stay behind?
That's exactly what we've been hearing. Look, if we look at Poland, for example, from what we were told from the refugees and the evacuees I have met over the last couple of days, they were given some 2 weeks in Poland to find themselves here and to either return to their home countries, which is what many Nigerians did on Thursday and obviously on Friday, but also it gives them the ability, they say, to travel into other European countries. You also have to remember that a lot of these students have valid Ukrainian visas, which would allow them, they believe, access into other countries. One of the countries that many Nigerian students have been traveling to after leaving Ukraine is Germany, because on the one hand they think that they're less likely to face hostility. They feel as though it's far more affordable for them to stay there and wait this war out. But in terms of immigration being an issue, that is definitely going to cause a problem. But they believe because they are refugees, there's going to be a humanitarian aspect of their decision to stay in Eastern Europe as opposed to returning to Nigeria or any other country and then reattempting to fly back. It's a numbers game as well. It's economics. Them thinking that perhaps they wouldn't get another visa should they leave. Them thinking that perhaps they wouldn't be able to afford a flight back into Ukraine or back into Europe once they leave. So it is quite difficult to understand their motivations, but also to have a clear picture of the immigration status of many of them. They are refugees, and if you have visas for visa, that doesn't automatically grant you entry to other European countries. So it is quite a tough time for many of them.
Well, you mentioned the word in passing. You talked about racism, which was an issue that we brought up with Ambassador Nuhu. And looking at you there, where you are in Medyka, I've only seen your good self and one other person who seem to have my kind of color. Is racism still a problem, even here at the border?
For me, as a black person stood here in Eastern Europe, I've tried to keep my head down. I have not experienced directly any level of discrimination that I could say could be attributed to racism, but I'm also not over the Ukrainian side of the border trying to fight for my way into safety. And I imagine that is where the bulk of people who have been complaining about racism have been receiving it, over the Ukrainian side of the border. You're correct. There are not many people of color here. None at all. The vast majority of them are Ukrainians, and that, as I was saying earlier, is indicative of the earlier reports of people saying that it's very difficult for people of color to cross borders into neighboring countries, and that just shows the reality, the fact that we are here at the Medyka border with Ukraine and we're not able to find at this point any Africans or any Nigerians who are currently here in the queue trying to get onto these buses that will take them into town. So race is clearly prevalent here, in the sense that there are differences of racial backgrounds between the refugees here, but it's not reflected in what we're seeing here. The diversity of refugees isn't reflected here. We've not seen any other refugees as it stands, other than people who are predominantly considered to be Ukrainian.
And I'm sure they must have tried. And obviously they weren't allowed to.
Absolutely.
But what's the frequency of those buses, Adefemi? How often do the buses come to ferry the refugees into town?
like clockwork. Once one leaves, there's another one immediately coming. So you can see that this smaller red one here is what is loading refugees on. And right beside me here, Sebastian, if you could just right beside me here, we can see that this is another bus, and behind that there's another one. So like clockwork, these buses are churning out people. And on our way to Medyka this morning, we were able to see lots of humanitarian aid in the sense of clothes, shoes, jackets being left on the roadside to allow people to freely go and take what they want. There are also vans serving soup and tea, trying to keep refugees warm. But in terms of the transport, it is moving like clockwork, and that is a good thing. That is quite positive to see that people aren't being left to wait for hours on end for another bus. They are moving. As one leaves, another one enters.
All right, Femi, two things I'd like to bring up. Number one, you said a lot of them are going to Germany. I mean, what are they using to stay back in Germany? Is it those that have the Ukrainian visa that are staying back in Germany? And what is the possibility for some of them to transfer their education to countries like Hungary, Romania, and the likes? Because a lot of them are trying to do that switch now.
If there were students, or if there are people traveling from Ukraine, they would all have Ukrainian visas, and it's unclear at this point whether or not it's that's making them believe that they'll be able to cross into other countries. But first and foremost, what they do say, what they do believe, is that their status as refugees would allow them passage into neighboring countries, including Germany. So it seems as though at that point, that is what they're trying, that's the point that they're trying to make in terms of making a case for them at other countries. You would have also seen that at a train station, a train station in Germany that had received a train that had travelled from Warsaw Central. There were reports that African people were taken off those trains. It's unclear why that was the case, but it just shows, again, that it's another indication that even if you travel into Germany and you successfully make it, racism may not be far behind there. So again, for people who want to stay, it's not as though they have a clear plan. This is a war. They are all refugees, and many of them are just trying to find a situation where they can return to their studies. So as you said, one of the options available to them is to transfer to a European university that would allow them do that and continue their studies. And many of them, Williams and Victory, in my report that you would have watched and seen, were both looking at different universities and seeing what their fees were like, because it's not free for now. As it stands, it's not free. They would still have to make their way financially to those universities and would still have to pay fees, albeit discounted. So we're hearing in Poland, for example, and in Germany, some universities are offering discounts of 40 and 50% in their tuition fees to refugees. It's unclear what the entry requirements are, and if any Nigerians at this point have successfully made it. I have not heard of that, but that's definitely an option that's keeping people wanting to leave Ukraine, make it into Eastern Europe, and try and continue their studies from there, as opposed to returning to their home nations.
Well, clearly, Europe has a humanitarian crisis, a refugee crisis on its hands. And you refer to these international organizations who are trying to provide help for persons fleeing from Ukraine. Do we have any information about refugee camps that have been set up in some of these neighboring countries? Or the people are just escaping to find their way?
From what I've been told, it is literally finding their way. As it stands now, no Nigerian, and I've been in contact with quite a few over the past couple of days, none of them who have made it into Germany, which is just one for now, none of them who have successfully made it into Germany have made it to a point where they can say that there's been pre-arranged refugee accommodation for them. No, they're speaking to friends and family, people who may know a person who's willing to take refugees. It's not at this point an organized situation where they know there's a refugee camp or an IDP place or a displaced persons area for people at all as it stands. If they do make it into Germany or any of those countries, it is believed that they are responsible for their own survival.
Well, thank you, Adefemi Akinsanya. Please keep safe and keep warm. I see that it's very cold out there. Thank you very much.